Hey, everybody. It's 12 o'clock, so we're going to get going. I'm Julia Reichel. I'm sorry I'm masked for this session, but I am multitasking at my day job at Margaretville Hospital, scanning people to come in for COVID tests. I won't be doing that this whole time. I am the co-chair of the Catskills Addiction Coalition. This session, sorry for the noise. This session is featuring Dr. Shelly Bartow, the Executive Director of Delaware Opportunities. She is talking about understanding risk factors and promoting resiliency in LGBT youth. We're super excited to have this session, and I'm going to mute myself and let Shelly take it away so the noise doesn't bother much.
Thank you. Hope you feel free to turn on your cameras. It's always more enjoyable to see people's faces versus black boxes, but I certainly understand if you don't have the camera or the capability to do that. I just want to share real briefly how I came to be presenting on this particular topic, and then I have some slides that I'm going to share, which we will follow up and send to all of you after the fact. I, in a previous life, was a sexual health educator for Planned Parenthood before they transitioned to family planning, and I worked with teens through a pregnancy prevention grant for many years there. After that role, I was the director for a dropout prevention program that worked with at-risk youth, and through both of those roles, I constantly was interfacing with youth who were having questions about sexual orientation or gender identity and didn't really have a lot of outlets or safe spaces to have those conversations. In fact, in many of the local school districts, there weren't gay straight alliances or any types of groups that supported, you know, having those conversations or talking about things that youth were struggling with. And so in a previous role, I worked very closely with a group of teens to create a group called Allies in Action, which is a group that still exists even after my departure in Shenango County, that is a place for 14 to 20-year-old allies, as well as a youth that identify as part of the LGBTQ population. And what it did is it brought the group to the community versus in the schools. And so students from any district across all of Shenango County can participate in the group. And they do a lot of activities, they do some education, they work closely with family planning, but that group still exists. And so a lot of what I'm talking about comes from experience working with youth in those settings, as well as I am a trained Trevor Project trainer. So some of my slides, you'll see the Trevor Project logo. And for those of you that aren't familiar, I share a link at the end of my slide, but the Trevor Project is a great resource for information. And it's the only 24/7 crisis hotline specific for LGBTQ youth. And since they were created, they now have added things like chat lines, as well as like online support groups. So there's a lot of different ways that youth can engage with the Trevor Project if they are in crisis, and regardless of where they live, regardless of any eligibility criteria or anything like that. So you'll see that logo on some of my materials. So I just kind of wanted to mention it. And I also just, like I said, wanted to share a little bit about who I was, because, you know, somebody, you know, you might be thinking, well, what does she have anything to do with LGBTQ youth? So I'm on dual screen, so I don't think that I need to share that differently. Hold on.
While you're figuring that out, I am now in a quiet place. I do want to say that we are recording this session for anyone who has joined since I said that before. So if you do participate, which we really hope you do, unmute yourself and make a comment when I call on you, or you can do it yourself as long as you're, we'd love you to. We really do encourage all questions and interaction, although we are going to try and let Shelly get through her slides too, because I think she has a bunch. Please don't participate if you're uncomfortable with us recording this session and posting it on our website later. Also, we'll have an evaluation at the end. I've already shared links to it in the chat box. And Shelly, we will be sharing this presentation with anyone who signed up and registered via email for this session. I will email you a copy of this PowerPoint. All right, take it away.
Thank you. So as Julia mentioned, I have a lot of slides, but I also, a lot of this information is just good information to have. So I was sharing with Julia, I always like to have more information than not enough information. So, I certainly welcome questions. I think that, building awareness and understanding this topic is kind of the key to helping us promote resilience in youth that identify as LGBTQ. And I kind of wanted to set the stage for why I feel like this topic is so important. And I think that the Trevor Project really focuses on not just how to be an ally or support people in being allies for LGBTQ youth, but also in terms of suicide prevention. These are some facts that I pulled off of the Trevor Project website, which again, I do share with you at the end of the PowerPoint deck. But these statistics, I think they concern me. And as somebody who cares about and works with young people, I think we all should be concerned. Suicide is the second leading cause of death among young people ages 10 to 24. What is really terrifying about that is not only 10 to 24, I mean, we're talking about a lot of young people, but the fact that it's preventable and it's the second leading cause of death, to me, what that says is that we as a society are not doing enough to help and support and build resilience in our young people. LGBTQ youth seriously contemplate suicide at almost 3 times the rate of heterosexual youth. So LGBTQ youth, because of a variety of risk factors, which we'll talk about, are more at risk for contemplating suicide than some of their peers. They're 5 times more likely to have attempted suicide. They're likely to utilize means that require hospitalization or medical treatment at a higher rate than their peers. Suicide attempts by LGBTQ youth and questioning youth are 4 to 6 times more likely to result in injury, poisoning, or overdose that requires treatment from a doctor or nurse. My expertise is not as much related to substance use as some of maybe our other presenters, but I think it's important to note that there is a connection here to the types of challenges or risk factors that our LGBTQ youth maybe are facing. 40% of transgender adults reported having made a suicide attempt. 92% of those individuals reported having done so before the age of 25. LGBTQ youth who come from highly rejecting families are 8.4 times as likely to have attempted suicide as peers who have reported no or low levels of family rejection. 1 out of 6 students nationwide seriously considered suicide in the past year. That is not specific just to LGBTQ youth. And I don't know about you, but that gives me goosebumps. The fact that in our high schools, 1 out of every 6 students, you could go around a classroom with 30 kids, have them count off by 6, and you're gonna have 5 kids in that one classroom that have contemplated suicide. So it makes me really question and want to talk about what we're talking about today and how we really help support and build that resilience for our young people. So I want to talk a little bit about sexual orientation and gender identity. And I know, I think that this is an important segue to the conversation about resilience, because I have this feeling, and this is just kind of my observation over years of kind of working in this field and working with at-risk youth, that as adults, sometimes when we don't understand things, it has to do with our inability. We try to, when we can't understand something, to put it in a box. And that's kind of how we try to understand things. We try to make sense of them within this box, which is like the context or the lens in which we make sense of the world, right? So each of us has different experiences and different knowledge that kind of creates the parameters for that box, so to speak. And so as things are presented to us, we're always trying to fit it into that box. So think about poverty, right? So my agency works a lot with low income individuals, a lot of families that are living in poverty. And I often hear people say, well, if they just got a job or they just got a better job, they could get out of poverty. Well, those of us that work with low income families know that poverty is much more complicated than just whether or not you have a job or not. And so again, people that don't really understand, the only context they have is that box, right? So think about substance use, same thing, right? I grew up with a father who was an alcoholic, and I know that it was much more complicated than just saying, well, why can't he just stop drinking beer every day? Again, we try to put it in a box that we can make sense of. Understanding LGBTQ youth and this kind of population in general, I think is the same thing. We try to put it in a box that we can make sense of. But the thing is it doesn't really fit in a box. And, I think we struggle to try to make sense of something that sometimes we don't really have to make sense of. One of the things I learned from working with youth for so many years is I don't necessarily have to know how somebody identifies to be able to support them, and what business is it of mine to understand that. So I like to share this complexity of sexual orientation and gender identity just as kind of an awareness building conversation, but as a way to get us to kind of understand how complex these issues that we're talking about are. So often when people try to put LGBTQ youth in their box, they often group sexual orientation and gender identity together, right? So if somebody's gay, then if a boy is gay, then he must also want to dress like a girl, because that's maybe what makes sense in my box. And these are two very distinctly different things that actually have nothing to do with one another. Sexual orientation has to do with whom we're attracted to, right? Most of us, all of us, not most of us, all of us, we don't wake up one day and decide this. It's just part of who we are, right? And we're going to talk more about that in a minute. Gender identity is kind of the sense of our gender and how we identify regardless of what our bodies look like. So again, complicated. We'll talk about that in a minute. So let's talk first about attraction. Give me an example, and you can type it into the chat or you can say it. Give me an example. Think back to middle school. Okay, that's typically the age where youth are starting to kind of pay attention to people outside of just, this is my best friend and I want them to, come over to my house. Like, you start to feel this attraction. All right, what is that attraction based on? Like, give me an example of something, a quality about someone that maybe attracted them you to them. For example, when I was in school, I played a lot of sports. I was very attracted to other young people that played sports. I wanted to hang out with those people because they had the same interests as I did. Can somebody give me another example?
Crystal Miller says personality.
Personality. Okay. What else? Sense of humor.
Tiffany.
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
Anything else? I know as an adult, I'm attracted to people that are intelligent. Bad boys. Okay. I might have had that attraction once in my life as well. Anything else? So we got intelligence, athleticism, personality, sense of humor. Nobody has mentioned physical looks or anything about sex. So my point is that there are a lot of different things that attract us to people. If you think about and fast forward to your relationships as an adult, typically our attractions are multifaceted. Even if you're attracted to someone for their physical appearance, usually that's not the only thing that you're attracted to. And if it is, often maybe that relationship doesn't last as long as maybe you'd like it to. So there's a lot of things that attract us to somebody. So sexual orientation, you can kind of think of like a triangle. We've got our orientation, our behavior, our identity. So our identity is our orientation is who we know we're attracted to, who we know, like deep inside ourselves. I know I'm attracted to this kind of person for this reason, or this, whatever, whoever it is that attraction is towards, and for whatever reason, that's your orientation. Your identity is maybe what you tell the world, maybe what you tell your friends. So let me keep going, and then I'm going to give you a perfect example of how this triangle is complicated. Your behavior might be, despite what you tell people, despite what you feel, your behavior is what that looks like in the real world. So I had a boy who identified as gay. So his orientation was that he was gay, and he identified as gay. He came out to our group that he was gay. He was attracted to other males. He often had girlfriends. And so when challenges arose in school, the teachers would often say, well, it's just a phase. He can't possibly be gay. He has girlfriends. And I would defend him, and I would say, I think he has girlfriends because he's being bullied, and that's how he protects himself when he's at school. Or he was attracted to those girls because they liked some of those same things he liked, but it wasn't a sexual attraction. It was an attraction based on totally something else. So when we're working with young people in particular, keep in mind, they're trying to figure this out. And it's not really up to us to make them or force them to figure it out as, at the speed we want, right? Like, why does it matter if somebody's gay or somebody is pansexual or somebody is asexual if we're helping them to be a resilient young person? So as adults, we have this need to dispute or prove that they are who they say they are. And sometimes when we get this mismatch information, it confuses us and we have an even harder time kind of figuring it out. And so my argument to you would be, I don't think we have to figure it out. We just have to be aware at how complex it is. And it's hard enough to be an adolescent, but you add trying to figure out that into the mix of it, it's even harder, especially if you live in a community or a family, or you go to a school where you don't get to talk about these things. There's no supports in place. Maybe you're getting mixed messages about it being okay to be something that's, non-conforming, if you will. It can be really confusing. And one of the things that I've been kind of disappointed, but turning more to excited about is when I first came to Delaware County, nobody was really talking about this. And I remember a couple people saying to me, well, we don't have kids like that here. And I was like, do you have kids? Because if you have kids, you do have kids like that here. To me, if you don't know about it, it's because this is not a safe place for kids to talk about it. And so every chance I get to talk about this topic, I say yes, and I'll keep talking about it, because I think that as adults and professionals, we have an opportunity to create safe spaces and help our young people feel confident and safe enough to have conversations about the challenges they're having and the support that they need. These are just a couple of the labels that we sometimes use. I would argue that we never really should be putting a label on a young person. These are also labels that people that identify as LGBTQ might use for themselves. So I would often, when we did our group, students would identify themselves. And I had people that were, I had students that had like 4 or 5 things in their list of like who they were and how they identified. And that was okay, because that's who they were. But sometimes, again, if we don't know what pansexual means, then we want to try to fit them in another box that we understand. And it doesn't really work that way. So this idea of gender identity kind of further complicates it, because again, we try to match up sexual orientation and gender identity together like they're one and the same thing, and they're not. And I just ask you to think for a minute, and if we had more time, we'd have more of a discussion about it, but like, think about the messages you've received throughout your lifetime about what it means to be masculine or feminine, right? So if you're masculine and as a young person, you're not supposed to cry. You're supposed to be tough. You're supposed to have, play sports and be muscular and go hunting with your dad, and you mow the lawn and take out the trash, but boys don't really do the dishes or kind of help clean the house. Like, think about all these messages, right? What kind of toys do you have? You have toys that are fighting toys. You have toys that are cars. You have toys that are more what our society has defined as masculine. I remember a time when my nephew was like 3 or 4 and he wanted a baby doll. And my sister got him one, and I thought that was great. And her in-laws were like, why'd you get him a baby doll? That's gonna, that's going to turn him gay, or that's going to be a bad thing for him. They said some really derogatory things. And I said to my sister, I said, good for you. I said, how do you teach little boys to be a good daddy? You get them a baby doll. Like, they, in the same way little girls want to be good mommies, little boys want to be good daddies. Or perhaps they see their father figure and they want to mimic that. Like, think about what kids do when they're really little. They mimic the things that they're seeing play out in their lives. And so it's just, I will never forget a time where I went toe to toe with my mother-in-law. My other nephew, when my daughter was about 4, she wanted to do this mommy and me dance class. This mommy didn't do it with her, a babysitter did, but she wanted to do this dance class. And my nephew, who's 8 months younger than her, wanted to do everything that she was doing. So he wanted to do the dance class too. I happen to know many males who have done dance classes for years. I dated a football player for a long time, and it was mandatory that they took a ballet class. So lots of athletes are involved in dance and gymnastics, whatever. And my mother-in-law, I'll never forget, I was in a living room. My father-in-law was there. My husband was there. My brother-in-law was there. Our kids were there. And my mother-in-law says, only little faggots take dance class. And I immediately, very aggressively told her I never, ever, ever wanted to hear her say that word again, that she was so far off base. I gave her 5 examples of boys that I knew who had taken dance. And she just looked at me. It was like the first time that I had really aggressively spoken up against her. And I don't think she realized that there was anything wrong with the way she was thinking, which was actually even scarier. But she has never used that language or talked anything like that in front of me or my daughter since that time that I called her out on it. But that's what was scary about that, and what continues to be scary about that, is she didn't think there was anything wrong with that thinking. And so think about what messages are our little boys and our little girls getting in our society when people really truly believe those messages that have been ingrained with them. Like, think about little girl toys. You got baby dolls, you've got a vacuum cleaner, you've got cooking sets, you've got a tea set, I remember my nephew wanting a toy vacuum cleaner, and we had to search for one that wasn't pink and purple, so imagine being an adolescent and feeling like you don't really identify with your own self, right? But yet there's all these messages floating around you that are telling you what it means to be a boy or what it means to be a girl. Think about how confusing that must be. Our sex and our gender are not the same thing. And so one of the things that frustrates me is, think about all the paperwork we fill out in our lifetime, right? I feel like sometimes people use sex and gender interchangeably, and they're 2 very different things. So your sex may be male and you might identify as a female. So sometimes our systems don't allow people to identify, how they truly identify. Our sex really has to do with biology, our body parts, what we're born with, and less about how we identify to the world. I had this argument one time. I presented to a group of college staff, and some of them were instructors. And I remember saying to someone that one of the biggest no-nos, especially in a college setting, is reading a roster on the first day of class, because you could potentially out someone to an entire class without even realizing that you've done it. So let's say you have John Smith on your roster, but John Smith identifies and goes by Jane Smith. And so what happens when you say John Smith to the whole class? And Jane Smith, who is dressed as a female and identifies as a female, is sitting in the classroom. So sometimes, because of our unwillingness to get rid of the walls of the box, we sometimes do more damage than we do good. So with gender identity, it's also like a triangle. We've got our identity, which is who we are, regardless of what our body looks like or appears to be. It's who we are. Our expression is how we show that identity to the world, right? So somebody could identify as male. They could identify as neither male nor female and still dress a certain way and that's what the world sees. So I had a student one time who identified as transgender. She wanted people to refer to her. Well, she went back and forth. For a while, she wanted people to refer to her as he, and she dressed like a female. So some of her peers and the instructors had a hard time with that because she wanted them to call her he until she switched back to she, but she didn't identify any different than they had ever known her to be. And so people had a hard time kind of making sense of that. Attribution kind of that's how the world sees you. So again, you can identify one way, show it to the world a different way, and yet the world sees you in a totally different way. So in both of these cases, these triangles the tips of the triangles may not match. And I would argue that in your lifetime, that may change. And probably for some of us, our triangles haven't always been the same. They may change, who we were when we were in high school or college may be different than how we identify or how the world sees us as an adult. When people come out, their identity or their attribution, how the world sees them, maybe changes a little bit. So I think you can see, without kind of harping on it, that we could have a whole day just to talk about what this means and what this looks like. So if it's hard for us to kind of like think, wow, this is a lot, think about how hard it is for an adolescent who is going through puberty and trying to make sense of this. So I want to shift gears a little bit, keeping all of that in mind, and talk about risk factors. So I think it's important to point out that times have changed, right? So it used to be, when we were younger, perhaps, that really when it came to bullying, let's say, you got bullied at school, but you went home, and home was your safe place, right? And the community kind of kept to itself. So even maybe the community was a safe place. Now, there are risk factors in the community, there are risk factors in schools, and there's risk factors at home. So our young people are facing risk factors. They really can't get away from it. So our best effort to support them is to really help them with coping strategies or mechanisms to deal with those risk factors that they may encounter. So when we talk about risk factors, just to make sure we're on the same page, risk factors are traits, attributes, or characteristics that are associated with suicidality or some other type of dangerous, people might have risk factors for other things. I'm specifically going to kind of hone in on suicide. Chronic risk factors are risk factors that increase over somebody's lifetime. Acute risk factors are risk factors that are associated, they're right now. They're things that are happening right now. They're warning signs that are right now. I would argue that as human service professionals, as educators, as parents even, we have the ability to impact and mitigate risk, both chronic and acute risk factors. So what are some of those risk factors? There's risk factors related to mental health. There's risk factors connected to experiences. So accessibility to firearms is a potential risk factor. Homelessness is a risk factor. Families who are in crisis is a risk factor. And some of you have heard me present, probably more times than you wish, on trauma-informed care. So not only just family crisis, but trauma in general is a risk factor. Academic pressure, non-suicidal self-injury. The one thing I want to be careful of to mention in regards to self-injury, like cutting is not always a warning sign for suicide. It can be a risk factor, but it does not necessarily mean that somebody is thinking about or planning suicide. So I just want to be very careful that we don't just assume and make that leap there. Loss of a loved one can be a risk factor. Risky sexual behavior can be a risk factor. Victimization. One of the things that I learned from the youth that I was working with over the years, like hundreds of youth, both allies and youth that identified as LGBTQ, is that despite our best efforts, the bullying that's taking place in our schools is really not under control. And I say this, I'm on a school board. I know my school district works really hard to try to keep it, make it a safe place for students, but there is a lot of victimization going on that we really, as adults, don't know a lot about. And it's subtle and it's sneaky, and it's sometimes happening at the hands of kids we would never expect to do it. So it's very easy for it to go under the radar. But I have had so many kids tell me over the years, they have been bullied and harassed, not only for their sexual orientation or gender identity, but an assumed sexual orientation. We had a student one time who did not identify as gay, but he was victimized and harassed because people called him gay and told him he was gay and convinced everybody else he was gay. And so sometimes that victimization happens to kids that, don't identify as part of the LGBTQ population. There was really a sad case. There was a boy that committed suicide. Oops, sorry. There was a boy that committed suicide or died by suicide in Norwich a couple school years ago. He hung himself in a tree in his front yard. And he was a student that was being victimized for perceived sexual orientation. Like, he just couldn't take it anymore. He did not identify as gay, but he was being harassed and bullied to the extent where he felt like his only option was to die by suicide. I believe he was 14. So what are some LGBTQ specific risk factors? So those risk factors I just mentioned are risk factors for all young people. These risk factors are specific to the LGBTQ population. The first is gender nonconformity. So if you identify in a way that doesn't fit into what society deems as normal, and I say that loosely because I don't really buy into that, that is potentially a risk factor, right? So if you are anything other than a male who identifies as a male and dresses as a male, or a female who identifies as a male and dresses as a female, anything outside of that potentially is a risk factor. Coming out is a risk factor. So I remember being in a group one time where the facilitators of the group were encouraging kids to come out. I would caution anyone from doing that because coming out is very complicated. And you don't know what kinds of things you'll put in motion as a result of coming out. Like, coming out should be a really thoughtful process. And I think young people really need to understand what they're doing when they make that choice. And it shouldn't be at the urging of somebody who doesn't know. Families, some of the most loving families I've ever known have rejected their son or daughter when they've come out and kicked them out of the house. So, are you putting a young person in a potential position where they're going to be homeless, right? Or are you putting them in harm's way because maybe coming out means that they're going to be ridiculed or harassed or victimized at school? So coming out is really complicated, and it's not something to be taken lightly. And it's certainly not something that we should do on the part of anyone else. One of my biggest frustrations is when we as human beings out somebody else. That is not our place. It's not our right. It's really irresponsible. When we're working with young people in particular, confidentiality is really important. And if somebody's trusting you enough to kind of share this about themselves, for you to out them can be really dangerous, and it can be really devastating to a young person. One of the things that I found is that sometimes young people would tell us how they identified, but they weren't ready to tell their parents. They weren't ready to tell the school. They weren't ready to tell anyone. And I took that as a compliment that they trusted us enough and felt safe enough to come out to us. But I also took with that a responsibility to kind of protect that information and be a support to that young person when the time came that they were ready to come out to other people in their life. Sometimes people try it out on the person they trust and see how it goes. And then if it goes okay with them, then maybe they're willing to, try it with the next person. A lot of times young people are worried that coming out will affect their friendships. Will my best friend still want to be my best friend if she knows that I'm attracted to, other girls or other boys? LGBTQ related victimization is also a risk factor, as well as some unique developmental stressors. I just want to see if I have that. I don't have that on the other side. So think about this. So imagine that you are gay and you want to ask another boy to the prom, but your school doesn't allow same-sex partners to go to the prom together. Or imagine, these are real examples, by the way, of schools I used to work with. Imagine that you don't really identify as either gender in particular, but you don't really do dresses. You're kind of like middle of the road. You really would like to wear a tuxedo to the prom. But your school has a policy that says girls have to wear dresses. And the only way you can go to the prom is if you wear a dress. Imagine your mom taking you to the pediatrician and the normal conversations about puberty come up, but you're really, you're really confused because you're not really interested in opposite sex partners, and your doctor's talking to you about all the things you need to do to prevent pregnancy, and you're not even really sure how you're supposed to navigate a conversation about the fact that you like somebody who is the same sex as you. These are just a few examples off the top of my head. There's a lot of things that happen throughout our adolescence and young adulthood that are unique, that uniquely affect the LGBTQ population. Here's another example. Colleges now are a bit more open and have LGBTQ housing, but prior to that, what did you do if you identified a certain way when it came to housing or shared bathrooms? People are, tired of talking about shared bathrooms, but this is a real issue for people that identify as LGBTQ. So again, all of these things are these uniquely specific risk factors for young people. Well, young people, but LGBTQ individuals in particular. So what are some of those warning signs? Having a plan for suicide and the means to carry it out. One of the most important things a couple really important things to remember about suicide is in our society, if you're on the Suicide Coalition for Delaware County, you've probably talked about this before, I'm sure. Just because you talk about it doesn't mean you're going to put the idea into somebody's head, right? So we have this misconception that if you put condoms in schools, then you're going to convince kids to have sex. Nope, kids are going to have sex anyway. I hate to tell you. Having condoms is a harm reduction tactic, and it's a means to help keep people safer. Talking about suicide is not going to put the idea in the head of somebody who was not already thinking about suicide. So because we're so scared of that idea, we don't want to talk about it. And when people come to us, we panic and we don't know what we're supposed to do. There's nothing wrong. And in fact, you're encouraged to say to people, if somebody's coming to you and you're concerned that they're thinking about suicide, one of the best things you can do is ask them, are you talking about suicide? Are you thinking about suicide? If somebody has a plan and a means to carry it out, one of the most dangerous things we can do, particularly with young people, is just let them go home. I've encountered this before. We had a student who was talking about suicide. She had a plan. It was 3 o'clock. It was right at the end of the school day. And the school district's protocol was to call MCAT. This was in Shenango County, call MCAT. And when they called MCAT, they were told that they were dealing with another emergency and that they would have to contact the local mental health center. So they called mental health, and mental health said, well, we're getting ready to close. We're understaffed. You'll have to take her to CPEP. I don't know if any of you have had any interactions with Binghamton General. They have a crisis center, which is where a lot of people on probably one side of Delaware County, Shenango County, Broome County, where those young people go. That person didn't want their mom involved. Their mom was part of the problems. So their mom had to drive them an hour to Binghamton, ridiculed her the whole time about how inconvenient it was, got in front of a psychiatrist. The psychiatrist, while she was interviewing her, the mom looked at her daughter and said, why don't you just kill yourself and get it over with? The psychiatrist released her and sent her home with no plan. So that student came back to us and said, why would I ever tell you that I'm thinking about suicide if that's what I'm going to have to go through? And the reason I share that example is that's not the only story like that I've heard. So my question through all of this is, what are we doing to help young people? Because that didn't help that young person. So having a plan for suicide is important. And it's important to recognize that you might be the only person that person comes to tell you that they're thinking about it or that they have a plan. And you don't have to know what to say. You don't have to know how to help them, but you have to know where to refer them to, whether it's MCAT or the local hospital or the police, even if you're not sure what else to do, or the Trevor Project. Like you can't take that information in from somebody and then just let them go. Other warning signs, expressing suicide feelings of hopelessness, signs of depression. One of the biggest triggers, particularly warning signs, particularly in young people, is that change in regular behavior. If all of a sudden somebody who's typically very outgoing and happy and engaged is all of a sudden pulling back and they're isolating themselves and they're disengaged, like, trust your gut. Like, if something's going on, like, it's okay to ask, what's going on. Sometimes traumatic things happen that can trigger, some of these warning signs, and maybe they're not thinking about suicide, but what if they were? Alcohol and drug use, increases in alcohol and drug use can be a warning sign, as well as increased isolation or withdrawal. So how can we respond? Again, most of us are not counselors. We're not therapists. We're not suicide. We don't work in the crisis center. We're just average, everyday people that interact with young people and young adults. And we need to know what to say when people share these things, right? One of the most important things we can do is really just listen, validate, and acknowledge. We don't have to have all the answers. We don't have to share an example of our own time where sometimes self-disclosure is even more dangerous than not. We just need to listen and validate. Telling someone, oh, it's going to get better. How, has anybody ever said that to you? Have you ever had a tough day or a tough situation and someone said, oh, just hang in there, it's going to get better? Has anybody ever had somebody say that to them? I feel like I really honestly feel like it's so condescending, and it totally invalidates what you're feeling in that moment. And I'm sorry, but if you're an adolescent, let's say you're 15, if your boyfriend or girlfriend and you just broke up, that is probably the most important thing that happened in your life in that moment. And so for an adult to sit there and say, oh, don't worry, when you get out of high school, you won't even remember that boy or girl. Like, how insensitive, right? So we have to be very, very careful not to discredit what they're feeling in that moment. Don't be afraid to talk about suicide directly. Are you thinking about suicide? Do you have a plan for suicide? You're not going to put the idea in somebody's head who is not already thinking about it. Ask about a plan to remove anything dangerous. Express your concern. Empower the young person to get help. Sometimes a warm handoff is even better. If you say to someone, well, here's the Trevor Project Lifeline, go head home and just give them a call after you eat dinner. Sometimes what you can do is sit with them and help make the call together, or call MCAT with them and be there with them until the point where it's maybe not appropriate for you to be there with them anymore. Like, there's nothing worse than being in crisis and feeling like you're just get shoved off to the next resource. So kind of, keep that in mind. And, I think it's important to know the resources. And I think one of the things that I'm hoping will come out of this conversation today, in terms of maybe next steps, is I think that we have talking and planning to do to determine what those resources are for our young people in our community. Because I don't think there's enough of them. And I don't think that we easily know what those resources are. This is just kind of a infographic of kind of what I just shared in terms of how to assist. So I want to spend the last little bit of time talking about resiliency, because that's why we're here, right? So all of that's super depressing and upsetting, but I think it's important to know, right? Because if we want to be serious about promoting resiliency, then I think we have to go in with our eyes open and really understand what it means to be a LGBTQ youth, particularly in a county as conservative as Delaware County. Let's be real. I'm not hearing people outside of these workshops talking about this topic. And that, again, that makes me, you know, I know in Shenango County, when I first started this work, there was only one school in the whole county that had a gay straight alliance. I think now at least half of them do. I think only a couple schools in Delaware County have them. So where are young people talking about this? Who are they talking about this to? So one of the things we can do to promote resilience in all youth is have effective clinical care that's accessible, effective. You know, one of the things that's difficult, having been with family planning for many years, one of the things that's really difficult for adults and parents is in New York State, young people have a right to access reproductive health care without their parents' consent. In an ideal world, young people would be talking with their parents and they'd be planning and talking about this care together. But young people do have a right to that care with or without consent. So if a young person is in need of reproductive care, let's say they're identifying in risky sexual behavior, you know, you can encourage them to, there are services. Family planning does serve Delaware County. I'm sure some of our local providers would see young people, but they have a right to that in New York State. Easy access to care, right? I always think about this word easy access and I kind of chuckle. And Julia will probably chuckle because here comes the conversation about transportation, right? Like, how do our young people get places? So, okay, so Shelly said, this is great. Young people can access reproductive health care. Well, that's great. How do they get there? There's no bus. Mom and dad, if they don't know about it, aren't going to drive them, right? They don't want to tell mom and dad. So what do? They hitch a ride with a friend or they don't go. You know, this idea of easy access is certainly complicated. It's great that we have services, but if our young people can't get to those services, then it doesn't really help them. The other thing I would say in terms of care, and it kind of falls under the clinical care, one of the struggles that I ran into with young people when I was in Shenango County was young people that wanted and needed access to mental health services or counseling type services, but their parents wouldn't consent. So one of the challenges was they can't receive that care without their parents' consent. So it's another thing that kind of further complicates things. And I just kind of put out there as something for you to mull over. Yeah, absolutely, Crystal. I think, you know, I had a parent one time who was very upset with us for giving her daughter, you know, condoms and getting her connected to the birth control pill. And she could not understand, nor did she care, that it was her daughter's right to access that. And we were like terrible people for having enabled this to happen. You know, and I guess it's great that your daughter's friends felt safe enough with you that they could ask you to do that for them. I think that that's certainly a compliment to you. So other promoting resiliency, restrict access to highly lethal means of suicide. So highly lethal, guns, right? What about drugs? Prescriptions? You know, I think about, I'm sure this is probably a topic for another presentation, maybe during the summit or even another day, but what kind of access do our young people have to prescription medication that's dangerous? That could be used. I'll be honest. We had a young person try to die by suicide by taking an entire bottle of Advil. I mean, adolescents are gonna be resourceful, but I'll be honest, if he had taken a bottle of some other type of controlled substance, he probably would have been successful. Because it was Advil, I think it was a little less scary than it could have been. But we as adults, I think, have to make sure that we're doing our due diligence to restrict access. And I think I've heard parents say this on panels and things, you know, we always think it's not going to be our kid, right? Our kid's fine. My kid's not thinking about suicide. My kid's never going to die by suicide. And so we leave medications out. We maybe don't lock up guns the way we should. We don't think that it could possibly happen to us, and then it does. And then it's too late to restrict access to those things. So, you know, just again, something to think about. The more connections we can create, the better. We know this, right? Every adult person in a young person's life builds their resiliency, increases their resiliency a lot. So the more connections, the more strong, positive connections we can put in a young person's life, the better. So, this is why I think what I liked about the allies group that we had is it wasn't connected to the school. So the kids already had some strong connections in the school. By having this group that wasn't connected to the school, it was like a whole new group of strong connections. So the more we can do that and spread it out, the better. Building on artistic, athletic, or academic talents. This is why extracurricular activities in school districts are so important. When budgets are tight, what are the first things they start to talk about? Music, art, athletics. These things are really important. And sometimes for some youth, being a member of the band is what they've got going for them. That's their connection. So it's not just about fun. It's not just about, oh, this is something extra. Those opportunities are sometimes so much more meaningful to young people than we even realize. Medical and mental health care, I kind of mentioned that before, and having skills in problem solving. So young people are not great problem solvers. They their brain's not fully developed. They don't always kind of make the best decisions when it comes to problem solving. So the more we can help them to kind of navigate situations, the better. I always think about this, even as adults, right? I teach an online college class and I have adult students, and we constantly talk about unexpected situations. And we talk through, okay, if this happens, what might you do in this situation? So we give them opportunities and spaces to talk about different situations and what they might do if they encounter them, because we know that sometimes problem solving is hard. So if we've already thought about it and we've talked about a solution, it's a little bit easier to know what to do if you encounter that situation. I also have this philosophy about coping mechanisms. So the worst time to try to develop coping mechanisms is when you're already in crisis, right? So if we have somebody think about yourself, you're having a terrible time, work stinks, your home life is falling apart. You're just like, you feel like you're in a downward spiral. The last thing that you can do in the midst of all of that is figure out coping strategies to get you to the other side of it. Really, really, to be most successful in being resilient, you have to have coping mechanisms in place before you get to the crisis, right? So we had a lot of youth that self-injured. So we would talk about other coping mechanisms that they could try first. So harm reduction, that they could try first before they got to the point where they were going to self-injure. So it seems silly, because when you're not in crisis, you're like, well, I don't really need to know my coping mechanisms, but you do, because you can think more clearly and think about, if I was in my right state of mind, what would I do in that situation? So working with young people to develop healthy, safer coping mechanisms is really important. So I think about, our agency runs agency operated foster homes. We have a big buddy program. We work with some at-risk youth. And a lot of times those youth have experienced trauma. And one of their coping mechanisms is drugs and alcohol. Because has anybody given them or worked with them to develop other different, healthier coping mechanisms? Probably not. So the more family, community, school support, the more resilience we can build. Positive media representations, like think about how the media portrays LGBTQ as a population. We don't necessarily have a lot of control over that, but we can advocate for it to be different. Locally, we can have positive media representations. We can also use that as ways to build awareness and open up discussion. When 13 Reasons Why came out, originally, as a person that worked with this population, we were really scared, because people, it really glorified suicide, and young people were really paying close attention to that. So instead of being fearful and not talking about it, we used it as a platform to have discussions with students and talk about what they were thinking, what they were feeling, you know, what their coping mechanisms could be. And it was really powerful because people really shared their personal stories, and it was really great. So support networks are important. Again, I kind of started the day's conversation by saying, you know, what do we have in our community for LGBTQ youth? And I think that someday soon, I hope that I'll be at a table with other people who want to start to have this conversation and figure out what we can do, even if it starts small. What can we do to support and promote resiliency and our young people in general, but particularly our LGBTQ youth? I want to share this because depending on how the conversation went, I wanted to talk about this, but I want to give a couple minutes for questions. But I share this because I think that this could be a really helpful tool in starting that next conversation, and looking at all of the things that make up kind of promoting resilience in a person. And this could really be a guide to what that support in the community could look like. I think that this is a tool that we could really use to identify what those supports look like and in what areas of kind of building individual resilience they promote. So you're going to have this PowerPoint. I do have some links to some resources. GLSEN is a great resource. They have safe space posters and things you can print out. But I just wanted to open it up. We have like 5 more minutes. I just didn't know if anybody had any questions. I know that was a lot of information to throw at you in a short amount of time.
Hey, can I throw in a 2 cents?
Sure.
So I put in the link there of the Dignity for All Act, and
Awesome.
I think I'm in Wyoming County where my kids go to school, and we've got really this great support. It's a very similar county to like Delaware. We're very rural, work-housing people, but that school district has done an amazing job with supporting the LGBTQ to the point that the kids actually feel uncool if they're not, like if there's, it's not cool to be straight, right? I mean, it's
awesome.
It's really embraced. At one point, my daughter wanted to go like kind of gender neutral and change her name, and it was very official immediately. She talked to the principal, and the next day, all the teachers started calling her by her new name. And I'm trying to think what the difference might be, because it's a very, I mean, it's very, you know, homogeneous.
You know what?
Farming community.
I think part of the difference, if I'm being honest, is strong allies. Because I think sometimes, like what I found in Shenango County is, as the voices of allies can start to open the door for more conversation and more planning and more activities to take place, and then people catch on to that. So I'm thinking in your, you know, maybe in your district, you know, there are allies who have made it okay to have these conversations and provide these kind of supports. And, you know, like I'll never forget when I started at Delaware Opportunities, I had a safe space sticker on my door. It was like a rainbow, a laminated rainbow thing. And it talked about like being accepting of everyone. And do you know that I had staff that went to my board of directors and said that I needed to take that off my door? And I was like, I'm not taking that off my door. I'm sorry.
I think that Dignity for All Act, I think that even though a lot of the administrator might be a little more conservative, and it's a law and they're going to follow the law.
Yeah, that's good. That's
the
good.
other thing I wanted to share that the school's done that I think is beautiful. It starts in elementary school on up, and it's the Leader in Me 7 Habits of Happy Kids.
Yep.
And they really took that seriously, and those kids really you know, they learn so much from that.
Awesome.
You know, responsibility and looking out for each other, and maybe that's part of it too. Is there's such a small, there's only like 50 to 60 kids per grade level, and they all, you know, really consider each other a family, so they look out for each other. So maybe those are, but I love that Leader in Me program. I think it's fantastic.
Yeah. I think I've heard of that. I think I've heard of that before. I think that I don't know. I think that as adults and as leaders in our own right, I think that we have a responsibility to create a culture where that kind of acceptance and culture can exist. And when I think about some of our other school districts or even our community as a whole, I don't know that we've done that yet or done that well. And what you're saying is wonderful. And I know that even in the school district that I'm on the school board for, yeah, we talk about the Dignity for All Students Act, and we talk about the things that we're doing. But when you talk to the young people, their perception of what's happening is different than the adults. So it doesn't always work everywhere. So I think we can use models like what you're talking about as examples of how it can work well. And then I think we can help advocate to help get people there.
Yeah. I'm going to call that we're at 1 minute.
Okay.
We've done this hour and I'm going to wrap up. I also want to say that I think education about LGBT issues is the way to go. Just talking about it really frankly, like especially the stuff that is so stigmatized. Like some of the stories you've shared, Shelly, are like profoundly like disturbing, and also just to be able to say this is what happened and this is what happened to this kid who hung himself in his front yard, right? Let's just be really clear about it. I've been toying with the idea of doing a Queer in the Catskills speaker series because there are lots of queer folks in the Catskills. I am one of them. And, you know, it's sort of along the lines of the It Gets Better advertising campaign. Like there are lots of adults living in this community. We're happy and healthy. I was elected to the town board in the town of Middletown. Definitely the first out queer person to do that. So, you know, there are success stories that we can share with each other. Okay. Guys, I put 3 links to 3 different evaluation forms in the chat box. We'll also send out an email to everyone who registered for this session with that information. You can get a certificate of attendance for this session, tell us how it went, what we could have changed, done differently. Shelly, that was just awesome. I was really excited about hearing this, and I'm delighted to hear this content. The more we can talk about it, the better. Casey, thanks so much for sharing. And everybody else, thank you also for sharing. I want to say that we hope you will sign up for other sessions this week. We have a whole week of content happening. We have 2 more webinars today. One of them is at 2 o'clock. It's on poverty. Frank Canavan, who runs the community food pantry in the town of Middletown, will be talking about poverty and hunger and its intersection with substance use. And then at 5 o'clock, we have a pretty eminent doctor, Justina Greger, who is going to be talking about opioids and elders, which is a super good hot topic for our region, where a lot of folks are just elderly, and opioid use is really common and not sort of seen necessarily as drug use per se. So we want you to join us for those sessions, and we also want you to have a great day. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everybody.
Have a wonderful day. If you want to save the chat with any of these resources, you can click on the 3 dots and download the chat. And I'll be emailing out Shelly's PowerPoint presentation as well. Right, Shelly?
Yep.
We're cool with that.
Yep. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks so much for sharing. I hope you do this everywhere all the time. And thanks for being such a beacon of hope for us. It's really helpful.
Bye.